Don't clap, I haven't said anything yet. You might want to take that back at the end. First, I'd really like to thank the organising committee for inviting me here, and Maxine Gilway in particular for organising everything. So thank you very, very much indeed. Can you hear me at the back? Is that all good? So it's an honour to be asked to be here, and it's a privilege to be among you. Today I'm going to discuss legitimation code theory, or LCT for short. LCT is an approach to analysing and shaping practice. There's a lot to it. So here I'm just going to focus on a small part of the framework to briefly illustrate why EAP professionals might find it useful. And I should say, and I should emphasise, that my expertise is LCT. I am not an expert in EAP, but luckily you are. You are far better placed than I am to see whether and how LCT can support and advance your work. So today is primarily about introducing LCT to you as sort of food for thought about whether it may be of use. The paper has four main parts. I'll start by introducing a key problem in education, which is segmentalism in research and in student learning. And I'll highlight an ironic problem that we have in addressing that problem. Secondly, I'll introduce some concepts from LCT that overcome those issues and which are being widely used in research and classroom practice. Thirdly, I'll introduce the notion of semantic waves, and I'll show how they suggest ways that we can design teaching that overcome segmentalism. And then finally, I'll discuss how semantic waves are also being taught to students so that they can crack the codes to success in education. And at that point, I'll also mention how they can help overcome that persistent dichotomy that we have in academic literacy between general and specific skills. And I'll highlight their implications for advancing social justice in education. So I'm going to start with a relatively concrete problem, and I'm going to shift up to more theoretical territory for a while. Stay with me, because I will be coming back down again to a concrete discussion of practice, and why I've just told you that will become clearer as we go along. So I'll start then with the practical problem in education, which is segmentalism. And that's when knowledge is so strongly tied to its context that it's only meaningful within that context. And in intellectual fields, we see segmentalism when research leads to a series of context-dependent models, and so new work fails to build and integrate past work. And in curriculum and pedagogy, we see it where students are taught a series of very segmented ideas or skills rather than building on previous knowledge. Now, of course, those problems they're not new. Indeed, overcoming segmentalism is at the heart of education. I think just about everyone agrees that we want to create research that's valuable beyond the original object of study. And everyone wants learning to have positive effects beyond the original context of a particular classroom on a particular day. But educational research has problems getting to grips with segmentalism. And one problem is, ironically, that knowledge is usually discussed in a very segmented way. So, for example, when thinking about the differences between, say, everyday and academic knowledge, a host of typologies offer dichotomies. Here's just some of them. And these kinds of models are often criticized for homogenizing each kind of knowledge. But many do then go further and divide knowledge up into academic knowledge up into different types. So you have studies that use models like Bigland's typology of disciplines into hard, soft, and pure and applied, or Kolb's types of abstract, concrete, and active, reflective. For example, in a book widely cited in higher education studies, Beecher combined those two to describe disciplinary tribes of researchers. And there are lots and lots and lots of other types. It's an industry to describe different kinds of knowledge. Knowledge of, knowledge about, knowing why, knowing that, everyday knowledge, theoretical knowledge, and so on. Now, both advocates and critics of models like that tend to focus on whether they cover everything. The caveats by authors admit that they can't do justice to all types of knowledge, and the critics say something's missing, and then they add another type of knowledge, such as, say, tacit knowledge. And if we ask this body of knowledge, what should we teach? The answer would normally depend upon which typology is currently in vogue. And then it would be very easy to show that whichever type is in vogue, there are other types, whichever typology is in vogue, there are types of knowledge that they've missed. It's an endless gravy train for academic debate. My point is that both the Both the caveats and the criticisms are missing the point. They both reflect an empiricist desire to draw a map as big as the country. The real problem is not whether there's enough types. The problem for me is that we need to move beyond this type of theorizing. Because ironically enough, typologies reproduce a segmented way of seeing knowledge. They describe types of knowledge, but they don't reveal the organizing principles underlying those types. That is, these models describe only the surface features of knowledge practices, such as what they're about. It's analogous to describing animals in terms of, say, them having fur or webbed feet or laying eggs or having a bill or whatever, rather than getting at their DNA. Why is that a problem? Why is that not just some sort of academic problem in the pejorative sense? Well, first, dividing knowledge into boxes that are strongly bounded from one another works perfectly until you actually try to use it in research or teaching. Then you find that nothing fits into a box. Everything's a duck-billed platypus that just does not fit the existing categorizations. Usually this problem leads to the criticism of whatever typology is being used and its replacement by another one that then repeats the same issues. A second problem is that these types are static and unchanging. Boxes are boxes. You can't see changes within them. You can't see changes between them very well, which makes it very problematic when we're analyzing anything that involves change, such as, say, I don't know, classroom practice that unfolds over time. And when I say analyzing, as a precursor always to helping to shape practice and change it. What's needed then are concepts that can analyze the organizing principles underlying knowledge so that we can see what lies beneath the surface features, the DNA of practice, and explore changes over time. We also need concepts that can be used in studies of all kinds of practices and all kinds of contexts because, well, firstly, we need to work out what's generic to academic literacies across all subjects, and also what's specific to different kinds of knowledge practices, different kinds of learners. But also, rather than creating a series of models for each specific subject, each kind of assignment, each kind of institution that cannot build on each other, that then leaves the community and the field itself very fragmented and weak, we need to build concepts that work across the disciplinary map and all the way up and down the institutional system in all countries. And that's what legitimation code theory aims to generate. So it's fairly modest in its ambition. LCT offers a toolkit, one built from and for empirical research. It enables us both to analyze and to change practice. And there's a body of work using LCT to explore a wide range of issues in education and beyond. It's growing pretty fast. There's a series of every 2-year conferences, biennial conferences that continues this July in Sydney. And in the past 3 years alone, there's been on average an LCT conference paper every 5 days, a publication every 10 days, and a PhD awarded every 5 weeks. And the rising profile was acknowledged 1 year to the day. This is the first anniversary, first birthday of the LCT Centre for Knowledge Building at the University of Sydney. And LCT is used to explore all kinds of institutional sites, from preschool to university, all kinds of practices, research, curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, across the disciplinary map, from physics to ballet, as well as professional and vocational education, and practices well outside of education, such as museums, the armed forces, law, climate change denial, Freemasonry, and so on. There's a whole sociological framework behind LCT that I'm not going to go into, except just to, like I say, I'm not going to go into it, and then I'm going to go into it for like 30 seconds, just so that you know it's there. As an account of society as a series of relatively autonomous social fields of practice where actors cooperate and struggle for status and resources. There's an account of practice as what's called languages of legitimation. In other words, our practices are also messages about what we think should be seen as legitimate, and they're related to those struggles for status. Basically, everybody's trying to make what is the basis of their position in the field the ruler of what is legitimate, what is worthy, what's a definition of success or valuable in the field. So there's a whole sociological approach behind this toolkit that builds on the work of people like Pierre Bourdieu and Basil Bernstein, involving power, struggles, and practice. But I'm only going to talk about it as a multidimensional framework, a toolkit that offers us mental tools to analyze and shape practices. This table just shows you that there's a whole bunch of key concepts. These are only the minimal ones, just to put you off. So to alienate your audience and then try and reel them back in is my method. That second part doesn't normally work, but there you go, we can give it a try. This just simply shows there's a number of ways to get at the organising principle. So what I'm going to talk about is only one part of this. And so that when you're thinking about it, don't think, oh, that's the only part of LCT. There's a whole range of organising principles that we have tools for. And basically people use it as a toolkit. Which tools they use depends upon the problem, depends upon the object of study. I'm going to focus just on semantics. That's focused on two concepts called semantic gravity and semantic density. And I'm going to first define those concepts. So bear with me through that. And then I'm going to illustrate how they're being used in curriculum and teaching and research. So semantic gravity describes the degree of context dependence of meaning, whether that meaning's in a curriculum or a textbook or a student essay or spoken aloud or whatever. And when something is strongly dependent on its context to make sense, we say it has stronger semantic gravity. And when it's less dependent on its context, it exhibits weaker semantic gravity. So for example, take the meaning of a particular plant in biology that has stronger semantic gravity than the meaning of a species of plant, which in turn is stronger than a process like photosynthesis or something that's very general. Or in history, the meaning of something very specific like the October 1917 Russian Revolution has stronger semantic gravity than the meaning of revolutions, which is stronger in turn than something like theories of historical causation, which have a much wider applicability. So it traces a continuum of strengths from the most concrete to the most abstract, but we don't have to use those terms. Those terms are not only unbelievably vague, I've never found anyone who could define abstract clearly to me, but also, and they're filled up with all sorts of axiological meaning, kind of political inflection, for example, abstract bad, concrete good, or the other way around. But we're not even in, it's not the only reason for replacing those concepts. We're not locked into static dichotomies. We can talk about movements up and down this range over time. We can talk about weakening semantic gravity, such as moving up from a particular case to generalizations and theories. Or strengthening semantic gravity, moving from a theory or a generalization down to a specific example. That's one concept. Glassy-eyed yet? You still with me? Okay, the second concept, I'll end on a song, so don't worry. The second concept is semantic density. And this refers to the degree of complexity of practices, whether they're symbols or concepts or phrases or gestures or clothing or body movement or whatever. It describes how many meanings are condensed within something or packed into something. So the stronger semantic density is the more meanings are condensed in it, weaker semantic gravity, fewer. Put another way, it describes how many meanings are related together in what we call in LCT a constellation. To show what I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples. Imagine a single thing, a single unit called a gwyphli. A gwyphli is a word that I've made up. It means absolutely nothing. There it is, completely isolated, nothing at all. Now imagine I say there are two kinds of gwyphli. There are A gwyphlis and B gwyphlis. So I've introduced two new terms and I've said that they're subtypes. I've described a little taxonomy of gwyphlis. And if I start going on to say that A gwyphlis are mammals and B gwyphlis are birds, we start relating them out to more and more and more. This strengthens the semantic density of the term gwyphli. This is what's called in LCT building a constellation of meaning. So we began with gwyphli. I distinguished two subtypes, and then one of those could have all sorts of various things. I've just made this up. One of them could be, related to, but two of them could be related in composition. One could be part of another one, for example. They could all be related to another thing that's a process that, if you zoomed in, was in itself a whole bunch of meanings. So semantic density describes how many things are related together, how complex something is. So if we take the term gold, for example, in everyday meanings, epistemic meanings, it's relatively simple. It condenses a limited number of epistemic meanings as bright, yellow, shiny, malleable metal used in coins and dentistry and jewellery electronics. But in the constellation of chemistry, it's embedded in a very complex set of meanings, of which these are only some. And many of those meanings are related to other meanings in things like compositional structures, taxonomies, explanatory processes, some of which I've highlighted in red. So you can see that it's situated within a very complex constellation of meanings, so it has much stronger semantic density. And again, we can talk about strengthening, so like I'm trying to do right now, condensing loads of meanings into something. So in history, taking periods, places, customs, people, condensing it all together in the term Middle Ages. Or in biology, taking cells and proteins and pigments and relating them together into the process of photosynthesis. And we can also describe weakening semantic density, so taking, say, a very complex term and unpacking just some of those meanings in a simpler manner. Now, those concepts can be used to analyze knowledge practices in two different ways. Firstly, we can explore organizing principles in terms of their strengths. We usually use plus minus, that's an inheritance from Bernstein, to mean stronger and weaker. And in LCT, we show these things on what are called Cartesian planes. So we trace a continuum. I didn't bring my laser pointer, so you'll just have to imagine me. A continuum of strengths from stronger to weaker. And yes, I'm fully aware, when I created the term semantic gravity, it has this sort of intuitive understanding to it. But it really fucks up my Cartesian plane here. Plus is on the bottom, because everybody thinks of concrete as at the bottom, abstract at the top. So this drives mathematicians wild. So we go from the most concrete to the most abstract, and from the simpler to the most complex. And then we use this to map practices, why I'm getting to in a minute. So if practices have weaker semantic gravity, stronger semantic density, they're relatively abstract, they're complex, that's called a rhizomatic code. So, for example, right now, what I'm describing is pretty complex and it's pretty abstract. I'm right in that code right now. If the practices have stronger semantic gravity, weaker semantic density, they're relatively concrete, they're simple, that's called a prosaic code. Think of everyday discourse, talking about the football, whatever it might be. It's worth pausing here just for a moment because they're the only two that are normally ever mentioned in typologies of knowledge. Knowledge is usually either both abstract and complex or simple and concrete together. Theoretical, practical knowledge, these all put those two together. They're the ones that they see. With semantic codes, we can see this as a false dichotomy with real effects for breaking out of that dichotomy. We can see that, for example, you can have weaker semantic gravity, abstract, but relatively simple meanings. Think, for example, of management discourse. Often involves absolutely nothing concrete and almost no meanings whatsoever. Or think of vocational education, has stronger semantic gravity and a stronger semantic density. It's concrete and complex. And this may sound all very abstract, but there are real issues at stake here. For one thing, people don't realize that one difference between jargon and theory is their semantic density. They're often lumped together and then bullshit masquerades as meaningful and theory is dismissed as unnecessary. We see this in public discourse. We see it with the dismissal of with the dismissal of experts and major economic and political decisions based on totally empty rhetoric. Nothing springs to mind immediately visiting Britain right now, but I'm sure that you can fill in an example. Similarly, most models of knowledge obscure what's distinctive about vocational education by seeing it as no different from everyday knowledge. Now, vocational knowledge may be very context dependent, a case for a lawyer, a problem for an engineer, but the complexity of the knowledge they bring to bear is very strong. Yet if we use the dichotomies I listed earlier, vocational knowledge would be opposed to academic knowledge and would be seen and lumped in effectively with everyday knowledge, which means you can write off an entire sector, you can move all the teaching into workplaces because they have no professional knowledge as far as that model would be concerned. So as EAP professionals, you might be fitting your own experiences into these codes as I speak, if you're awake enough on a Saturday morning. For example, generic skills may sometimes be a bit abstract and simple sometimes, or you might find that there's complex skills that are locked into a specific context that you're teaching or whatever. My point is that those two are often missed by existing models. And semantics tries to release us from these false dichotomies so we can start to see more. I've mentioned four codes, and I was criticizing boxes earlier on, but it's not about boxes. We could analyze every instance of words on a page, or chapters in a book, or books in a discipline, or interactions in a classroom. We can map each one of this on the plane and then come up with a sort of scatter graph like that. We can see the range of codes that are in play that are all struggling for dominance and see which one's dominating. We can do that for another discipline or another classroom or another day, and then we can compare the two and their main codes. And we can also do things like analyze change over time through and across the plane, even when it stays similar in its main code, but we can still see change. So we're no longer homogenizing difference, we're not concealing that difference, and we're embracing complexity and change with these concepts. And crucially, studies have shown that ideas are the different codes have different effects on research and teaching and learning, as I'll go on to show. Now, another way, and the last bit of being up here, is that we also use these concepts to chart change over time in a particular way called a profile. And this is going to be key to the rest of the talk. This is what I'm going to use for the rest of the talk, is profiling. So what we do here is we chart semantic gravity from stronger to weaker and semantic density from simple. So basically concrete and simple, abstract and complex, as a continuum. And then we analyze it over time, or text time if it's in a text. And then we can analyze and see how things change for semantic gravity or semantic density, or if you want to keep it simple, if they're moving opposite directions, we can just trace both. I'm going to do that from now on. I'm going to try and keep it simple, and I'm going to only trace them moving together in opposite directions. And I'm only going to talk about a couple of profiles to keep it simpler as well. I'm going to talk about, so this is the last thing you need to take in. Well, no, you want to take in everything, but it's the last bit of technicality, as SFL calls it. I'm going to talk about these kinds of profiles. The top one, A1, is called a high semantic flat line, a high flat line, because it's a flat line and it's high. A2 is called a low flat line for reasons that you may be guessing at this point. P is called a semantic wave. It doesn't have to start at the top and end at the top. It can start anywhere, end anywhere. The main point is it goes up and down. And on the right, you can see that we trace out their semantic ranges, what we call semantic ranges. And you can see the flat lines don't move much, the wave does. Well, that's all very well, Karl, but what's the point of all that? Well, these ideas are being used as tools in research into a wide range of subject areas and levels of education. This is just some of them, from cultural studies to physics. And this list is already outdated. You can find everything, anything I mention, or on the slides at the website at the bottom of the slides. I can give you only a brief taste of some of this work. I'm going to focus only on two areas. I'm going to focus on how semantic waves, those moves up and down, in teaching can help overcome segmentalism in the classroom and help build knowledge, and how teaching semantic waves to students can help give them the keys to the codes for success in education. So we've done a lot of theory, and we're now going to move into more practical territory because we're going down the semantic wave at this point. So let's start with teaching practice. Over the last 8 years, I've run two major projects into secondary schooling that's used a combination of LCT and systemic functional linguistics, or SFL, in collaboration with Jim Martin, to explore knowledge building in classrooms. And there were two main projects. The DISCS project studied lessons in history and science across secondary schooling. And then the PEAK project for the last 5 years has analysed whole units of study, that's about 6 hours of lesson time, in years 7, 8, 9, and we're now doing 10, in history and science at 3 schools with very different socio-economic profiles. And that's been a huge undertaking. I used to have hair. Generating a massive backlog of analyses to write up. But what became clear pretty early on was that classroom practice had to traverse a kind of semantic gap between high-stakes reading and high-stakes writing. So on the one side, you've got the educational knowledge that students need to learn, usually embodied in written forms, such as textbooks and access through things like reading. And on the other side is the knowledge that students must display in their assessments, mostly also written. And in between is the classroom discourse, which is mostly spoken language. And our analyses of the teaching texts and of the student assessment showed that both sides have much weaker semantic gravity and stronger semantic density than the knowledge expressed through classroom discourse. What's spoken in classrooms is usually more concrete, usually more context dependent, usually much simpler. So one question was, how do you get from one side to the other in a classroom? And our analyses highlight a whole range of semantic profiles, and I'll just describe two. One that we found very widely in classroom teaching was a series of downward shifts from highly complex, decontextualized ideas towards simpler and more concrete meaning. So teachers did this a lot. They simplified, they unpacked ideas, they made abstract ideas concrete. So for example, in history, the teachers would focus on reading through a text or a source, or they'd be watching a video and they'd stop it and they'd explain words and ideas to the students in everyday language with concrete examples. And they didn't then move back up out of the examples in the everyday language back into the specialized discourse of history. They'd return to the text or the video or whatever it was, and they would repeat the process over and over. In science, similar examples with text, but also with practical experiments. The students would often learn some scientific principles, put those ideas into practice, into a prac, into action, in an experiment, and then move back and learn more theory. So what was happening is a repeated movement downwards, and the teachers, not all the time, but teachers were often modelling one form of movement in knowledge, but not how to get back up to the high-stakes writing that the students would have to do in the assignments. We frequently encountered this down escalator profile. It wasn't all of doom and gloom, though. We found examples of not only downshifts, but also upshifts. They traced semantic waves. And this offered the possibility of modelling transitions from very context and simple knowledge up towards more integrated and complex meanings. And to show you what I mean, I'll take you through one small, tiny example. A single little sort of wave from Year 11 history in a school in Sydney. And in this example, the teacher's discussing an assessment question for a take-home assignment, and she's reading through the questions with the students, explaining what each question means and what they need to do to be able to answer this on their own. So this is high-stakes reading of complex and generalized meanings. The topic of this question is, what was the influence of Greek and Egyptian cultures in the Roman Empire? So we've got terms like Greek culture, Egyptian culture, Roman Empire, that in history condense a range of meanings. They embrace a wide range of ideas and practices and people and places. They have particular meanings in history, understanding the basis of which is central to being apprenticed into its cultivated gaze. And the question also asked about influence. It asks about historical processes of causation, which is, again, complex and generalizing. And the teacher begins by saying, this is a little bit hard, the influence of Greek and Egyptian cultures. What does that mean? What would the influence of Greek and Egyptian cultures mean? Okay? No idea, right? So she's beginning here by indicating the knowledge being discussed is relatively high on the semantic scale. It's a little bit hard, no idea, right? As an aside, we found a lot of these tells from teachers. They would actually indicate to the students, without even noticing it, sort of a nervous, almost tick, we're quite complex now. And then she explains by telling the students to think about the things in Pompeii and Herculaneum. What objects might be showing Greek design or Egyptian design or Greek mythology? Or what building techniques like columns? Are there Greek columns? Are the themes of their artwork reflecting it? So to start unpacking and moving down the semantic scale, students are given a series of examples of what the influence of other cultures might mean. She's specifying, she's unpacking meanings from, for example, the influence of Greek culture to Greek design, to specific examples like building techniques, to very specifically columns. And she also provides a second means of contextualizing all this. She grounds it in the context of the time by asking the students to put themselves into that period, reminding them of what had happened already. Pompeii had been settled by the Greeks and everyone was dead. Cleopatra had been killed, Mark Antony is dead, Egypt's part of the Roman Empire. So in terms of the semantic profile, it's all down so far, all downwards. But then she starts moving up again, up and out of these contexts. She weakens semantic gravity by discussing recurrent events rather than specific events, such as massive amounts of trade going on, ambassadors going back and forward over long periods of time. And she strengthens semantic density by packing these things up into trade and ideas, and then into the technical term, aesthetic trade. This doesn't end with a single cycle, obviously. Classrooms are fluid, they continue. In this case, she then moves down again to start unpacking that. She provides an example of aesthetic trade, how it's concretely paid out, with a bit of singing as well. La 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 la. That's not exactly how she did it. So we have some semantic waving going on here. She begins with a highly abstract and complex set of terms in the question. She unpacks some of the meanings condensed in the question using specific examples. She then packages those meanings back up into the term aesthetic trade, and then she moves down with more examples to ground that term. And this keeps going on. And that's just a very brief example among many, many, many that we've analysed. And I don't have time here for more. But from our analyses over several years of schooling, as well as comparative studies into higher education, we conjectured that one way of crossing the semantic gap between high-stakes reading and high-stakes writing may be a series of semantic waves that unpack academic discourse into simpler language with examples, concretizing ideas, offering simpler meanings that can connect with the everyday experiences of students and provide a starting point for their entry into the complex constellations of academic knowledge. But don't stop there. They then repack those ideas back up into concepts and terms and processes and so on, and they do this over and over again, connecting ideas together into those complex constellations. And over time, this could potentially rise higher. The troughs might be less shallow because they wouldn't have to start from scratch. They'd be able to use previously learned concepts and ideas. Now, that image was one that we just traced out as a conjecture about 8 or 9 years ago, and it's highly simplified, obviously really, really simplified to highlight my overall point. And in the first project, we analysed the smallest units of waves we could find, such as, for example, the example I gave you in about 2 minutes of class time, so really small. But in the PEAK project, which is the second project, the recent one, we analysed whole units of study, years 7, 8, 9, and now 10. And this is a profile from analysing every second of 4 science lessons on the seasons. That's about 6 hours of videos, involving all kinds of activities, experiments, watching videos, animations, discussions. We're writing this work up right now, but my point here is simply that you can see, at a grossly big level, this big cresting wave that this teacher does with the knowledge that she's teaching through these lessons, and the knowledge that the students are also expressing in the classroom through these lessons. And this and others like it are in stark contrast to other schools, or lessons that didn't build on past knowledge and remained very concrete and simple throughout. These are 3 lessons, I couldn't get it to work in the same colouring, 3 lessons on the same topic at another school, very broken up. Should be able to see that there's lots of breaking up. You can see it's really low. It's very segmented. And this isn't just finding, we're not just finding this in science. This is 3 lessons of ancient history in which the teacher successfully builds up the knowledge of the system of the government of Sparta and brings it all together. As you can see, these are huge, long periods of time. This was about 4 hours of video, but we did actually analyse every single second of this, which is why I used to look so much younger than I do now. But you can see that she's moving up and down and brings it all together, as opposed to this teacher, and we actually moved the profile. We moved it up so that you could see it, because it was virtually on the bottom, very concrete, very broken up. The students heard only very segmented little bits of history here, that nothing was brought together, nothing went beyond its immediate context. So my point really is that as we move from short interactions to whole lessons to whole units and so on, we seem to be finding a fractal pattern of waves in classrooms where they are building knowledge. Semantic waves don't seem to happen just over a few minutes, but also across hours and even potentially years, waves upon waves, which suggests that semantic waves may be a crucial part of knowledge building. Indeed, studies are suggesting that it's a key to cumulative development in research, curriculum and student learning. So, for example, studies of research. I've made these waves out. These profiles are just for illustration, but often in educational research, we're often offered research that's a low flat line of empirical descriptions. You know, the sort of thing, a description of a very, very specific thing can't be integrated with research in other classrooms on another day because it doesn't generate any principles that moves beyond that very, very specific object of study. Or you get talks or papers that are high flat line, freely floating theory that engages very little with the data. Lots of theory in educational research is like this. Sounds great, but it can't reach empirical reality at all. Both flat lines have a very limited semantic range to them, whether high or low. In contrast, LCT studies are suggesting that theoretical approaches that build over time describe semantic waves. They have to have concepts that can be enacted within concrete empirical descriptions, and these have to be able to move back up towards abstract and complex concepts that can be used in another context and brought back down to that context. Just as significantly, social waves seem to be an issue of social justice in education. Why? Well, because studies of student work in schools and universities are showing that waves play a role in what's defined as success. These portrays 2 essays, one high-achieving, one low-achieving. They're from a unit in secondary school English taken by all students in New South Wales in Australia. That's the biggest state department of education in the world. And in this assignment, students discuss 3 texts in relation to an abstract idea called the journey. And the high-achieving essay traces a series of, my collaborator on this project actually traced the student down. It was offered in a book of model answers, and she actually managed to trace the student down, and she'd gone to Harvard. And it was a she, the author of that text. Traced a series of waves between high-ranging literary ideas and very concrete particularities of each text that the students had to discuss, not the teacher. In contrast, the low-achieving essay was really a flat line, and I should really present this with lots of the gaps between each text, because it was very segmented. It was very concrete. It was just took each text and said, I like this one, I don't like that one. So to succeed then, students must wave between personal and academic knowledge, examples and theory, concrete and abstract ideas, and studies of student assignments in other subjects and at school and at universities, showing how semantic waving seems to be crucial to success across the disciplinary map. But not everyone can do this easily. Why that might be the case, we can see by using semantics to analyse not only the educational practices that students meet at education, but the dispositions they bring. Studies using ideas from Bourdieu, from Bernstein, from systemic functional linguistics and other approaches over the past 50 years have shown that things like generalization, abstraction, objectifying distance, focus on form rather than function, and other orientations to meaning that enable a greater semantic range are associated with the socialization practices of some social groups more than others. For example, studies often suggest they're more prevalent in cultural middle-class families than they are in working-class families. So students arrive at school with different semantic ranges by virtue of their previous experiences. Some students are more able to wave and so more likely to succeed. So a key issue is how this movement up and down can be modelled in classrooms, how teachers can help extend the students' semantic range to give them a chance to succeed. And in LCT, people are trying to do this in a number of ways. Semantics, for example, is being enacted in formal programs of academic development and teacher training. It's being used by individuals to shape their own teaching. It's being used in curriculum design and for teaching students how to succeed in assignments. And I'll very briefly go through each of those. In academic development, the ideas are underpinning how teaching staff are trained. So, for example, at universities across South Africa, academic developers are explicitly teaching semantics to lecturers and tutors. Similarly, they're forming part of courses for pre-service school teachers. In both cases, concepts like semantic waves are taught as an explicit methodology, just the waves part usually, as an explicit methodology for lecturers and school teachers to use in designing their own teaching. In other words, they're used to empower teachers to analyse and shape their own practice. Less formally, individual teachers are doing similar work on their own teaching in subjects as varied as chemistry, ballet, TESOL, jazz, not only in formal schooling and universities, but also in private institutions like dance companies, private music teaching. And in using semantic waves, both these programs and these individuals are trying to model ways of moving from concrete or simple practices towards abstract or complex practices and vice versa, with the aim of helping students avoid the segmentalism caused by flat lines, such as remaining locked into very context-dependent or very abstract ideas. Another means of modelling semantic waves is to design it into the curriculum itself. And LCT is underpinning this in curriculum that wave between abstract and concrete or theoretical and empirical forms of knowledge, and also sequence those waves to extend the semantic range of students more and more by progressively reaching higher towards more generalizing, more complex ideas. I've chosen some examples on the slides, which I'm sure that we will make available, just simply for their variety. Psychology in Australia and further education, a private engineering college in South Africa, large EAP programs in China and Singapore. In some cases, LCT is used tacitly to shape the curriculum, doesn't appear anywhere. In other cases, this doesn't just shape the curriculum, it also appears in the curriculum as tools students are taught to use. And that brings me to my final thing and the most common use. Teaching students LCT as a means of cracking the codes of achievement in education. And I've highlighted some examples of EAP with some contact names as well. In Singapore, big courses, Steve, who introduced me here at Durham, as well as China, and private language schools in Australia, Navitas English, and various papers that are all available on the website. Now, each practitioner does things differently, partly because of differences in disciplines, which I'll come to shortly, partly because they're inventing new ways of using these ideas. And there are papers by Steve and by Ingold and O'Sullivan and so on that are very readable and explain their methods. And here I'm just going to focus on one small example from my own university by Esther Senesh, who takes assignments that score very high marks. She works in the Learning Centre at my university, and she analyses their profiles just using semantic gravity at the moment, and then she teaches students how to achieve those profiles. This slide isn't for reading, obviously, it's just to illustrate the materials she provides to students. This one is for workshops on critical reflection essays. On the left is a gravity profile of an essay deemed exemplary by experts in social work. and on the right is the first page of materials that go on to say what a critical reflection essay is, and they describe semantic gravity in simple terms and then talk about that profile. So here we've got LCT being taught to students explicitly, and then they use it themselves. They use it in, for example, to analyze their assignments. They profile what the question's asking. The writing on that slide is simply the question, to try and get a sense of the sort of range of things that they're supposed to put in there. And they also use it to plan their work. They use it to draft their essays. They use it to actually start drafting their essays, either the whole essay or paragraph by paragraph or inside paragraphs sometimes. They'll use them, drawing often a wave down the side, for example, to make sure they're moving from examples to more abstract ideas. All of this brings me to my very final point, the issue of generic versus specific in academic literacy. Now, I've given very suspiciously looking similar profiles to make a very simple point about the significance of semantic waves. But that's not to say they're all the same. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Research is showing generic features of successful assignments, like they all wave between different forms of knowledge. They also show subject-specific features, such as variations in these waves. For example, here is a gravity profile for a critical reflection essay in business. It starts with bigger waves, which then subside as the everyday and the academic are weaved closer together. Here's another critical reflection essay, but in social work. These are both at the same level. They're at university, both the same level. It begins with a flat line, this one, at the bottom, as the student recounts a critical incident in their practice as a social worker, and then it goes through a similar kind of moving together smaller waves. So both of these are critical reflection essays. They're both at the same level, both at the same university, but they do things differently. In other words, along with these generic features, we find a series of specific issues at play that vary according to the subject, the educational level, and the kind of task. In fact, studies are finding a number of differences, such as how far up and down they go. You can go too high. There's a study by Helen Georgia, a whole PhD, on how physics students can fail by getting too theoretical, not just being too concrete. Whether going up or down is more important. Whether, like in sociology when I teach, it doesn't matter what the examples are really. Going down is just, arbitrary where you land. It's just to illustrate Durkheim's concept of anomie or whatever it might be. Whereas in more vocational, it might be that down at the bottom is much more important. You're just going up to grab a bit of theory to explain it. Where on the profile you start and where you end is really important. I'll give you some examples of that. If no one wants to ask me any questions, I'll do. How well the ideas are connected, or what's called semantic flow, and how important it is to be factually accurate, which can vary considerably between subject areas, actually. And finally, what stronger and weaker semantic gravity and semantic density looks like also differs too. For example, stronger semantic gravity could be personal experiences, it could be examples from data, it could be mimicking everyday movements in dance. It all depends on what you're teaching. There's not one code to crack, there are many. Education is an enigma machine. But these concepts give teachers and students the tools to begin cracking that code, to crack enigma. So to conclude, first, LCT allows us to analyse knowledge practices without becoming segmented by offering lots of little models locked into their specific contexts that don't speak to each other. Studies use LCT to research everything across the map of disciplines. We can see what they share, such as waving. We can see how they differ, such as the shape of the waves. And that's crucial if we want to raise the status and the explanatory power of fields like educational research and fields like EAP, because it allows those diverse studies to speak to each other, to work out ways to help students across those maps. It doesn't just reveal the rules of the game, it also provides students the means to succeed and then to change the rules of the game, because that doesn't happen through endless critique and wishful thinking. It only ever happens by revealing and learning to win at the rules of the game. And secondly, LCT suggests that exploring these profiles might give us insights into how we can become more cumulative. It suggests teaching students semantic waves might be useful, and that's not the only thing LCT offers. There's a dimension called autonomy that I'm really excited about, that shows you how you can relate and weave together knowledge from different sources, which would be very important to a field like EAP. But hopefully it's given you a bit of a flavour of how this framework works and what it might be able to do for you. And lastly, I should add that LCT tries to practice what it preaches. It tries to reach from the most, as you can see, and it gets worse, some of the most abstract concepts to very concrete practices. When we were teaching teachers in a pedagogic intervention, and then they were using it with their students, they were just doing that. That's pretty concrete when you ostensive definition, basically. You have to be there. They just use that as the symbol. LCT tries to semantically wave. It tries to bring together practice and theory into closer relation. Kurt Lewin said very famously, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. To that, I would add a good theory is one that is practical. Thank you very much.